Amen. So just for the benefit of the camera, and there have been a few other people join in the last couple of minutes, this is possibly my last presentation of this series for maybe a month. Next week I won't be presenting, others will present, and then the week after that, in 2 weeks' time, the Canadian ministry are conducting an online camp meeting. A camp meeting via Zoom, similar to what 𝗃𝗶𝗱𝗲 did in Portugal. So my participation in that will be hosted from here, of course, and my participation will consist of 8 presentations over Friday, Sabbath and Sunday. You'll be maybe happy to know that they're going to keep me to about an hour. So the 8 presentations is probably worth about 2 Sabbaths. So this is about possibly the last that I'll be doing of this series for about a month, but others will be presenting. So I want to try and wrap up some thoughts today. You can see that I've erased most of the board, and I was really sad to lose our growing list of conspiracy theories. I was growing quite fond of our growing list of conspiracy theories. It seemed that new ones could be added every week. I think we could have a whole board just of conspiracy theories if we put our minds to it and how they operate. We've lost our portion on the top left corner showing the compare and contrast between ancient Israel and modern Israel, the ancient idolatry and the modern idolatry through those, in each history, 3 particular dispensations, particularly considering the Alpha and the Omega. We looked a lot at those lines also through the lens of progression, which we will do quite a lot of this morning. So I want to be able to, I wanted space, so that's erased. I've kept this bottom left-hand corner showing, this actually, I'm really grateful, Sister Josephine asked a question about what we're all teaching, and it was a really good question, because it actually helped us draw this out and think about what are we teaching, what are we challenging, what Adventist beliefs are we challenging. And I think what we were trying to demonstrate was we're not actually challenging the core conclusion. So when you believe that there's going to be a one world government, we all believe that. We all believe in the concept of the Sunday law. The Sunday law is the breaking of the Republican horn of the lamb-like beast. So we believe in the breaking of the Republican horn. We believe in church and state. We believe in true and counterfeit. We believe in secret societies. We believe in all of those things. But what we were working out together was, what does that look like for us compared to the Adventist church structure? The Adventist church structure and apostate Protestantism, because you can lump them in one. And we tried to demonstrate that through the study of idolatry. So we showed we believe in this. But there's 2 different definitions of what that looks like. One is this threat by seeing the threat as globalism. So Fox News will tell you that the threat is globalism. CNN will teach you that the threat is unilateralism. Fox will tell you the threat is globalism. If the threat is globalism, you believe that through conspiracy theories, and Donald Trump becomes your hero. CNN tells you the threat is unilateralism, uni meaning one superpower. You will understand that through the methodology of parable teaching. Just one example is World War I plus World War II equals World War III, triple application. If you believe in this, Trump becomes the dictator. So while we believe the same thing, what you believe that looks like changes your perspective of where the threat is going to come from. And when you understand that Donald Trump becomes the dictator, it changes your entire worldview. At the same time, you're not challenging that core conclusion. You can do the same thing with secret societies. We all believe in secret societies. Protestants believe in secret societies. We showed that in 1798 with the Illuminati threat. Adventists, conservative Adventists, 𝗬𝗲𝗃, they all believe in secret societies. We believe in secret societies. We talked about that when we discussed dominionism, Seven Mountains theology. There's another movement that was how they defined ninja sheep, the people that they have in these seven mountains that are trying to take over or control the culture of the United States, particularly. And we went to Ellen White quotes to show that. We would define the Ku Klux Klan as a secret society. So both sides believe in secret societies. We disagree on what that looks like. And when you understand what that looks like, it changes your expectations or your entire end time worldview. So in anticipation, putting that to one side at the moment, this is a little bit of a detour. In anticipation of the Canadian Zoom camp meeting, for those of you that will be participating, I'd like to suggest a project, some homework. It's really difficult when we consider the lockdown, the change in travel plans. Schools have been cancelled. Even though we can do some on Zoom, many camp meetings have been cancelled. By now I was to do at least 3 camp meetings since Portugal. None of them have taken place. So our plans have been very much derailed. We were soon to have an international camp meeting. There was to be schools, weeks of studying together, digging out these lines and truths. So due to the shutdown, much of this has not been able to take place. And part of the difficulty is covering in about 1 or 2 presentations a week what we need to be remembering at this time. And I become concerned that we start to lose our place on the lines. So I want to suggest a project to anyone who's willing. Go to the lines that you know of, all the lines that show our experience. If you have copies that someone has done, some people have done online PDF copies. I try to suggest everyone, even if you have those online formally done copies of the lines, draw them yourself. And what I'd like you to do or think about doing is put a dot or a little person where you are on those lines. Take each one of them, go through them one by one and say, this is where I am on that line. So I'll give some suggestions of where to start. There are many more lines than this, but these are the ones that are in my mind. I need to take these off. Take Acts 27. That was the foundational message of the Midnight Cry. It was the increase of knowledge of our latter rain Sunday law history. There is so much in Acts 27 to explain our experience as Adventists. So take the study of Acts 27. There's 2 lines in that study, the ship of Adramyttium and the ship of Alexandria. For both of them, place yourself on that line. We're going to come back to Acts 27 in a moment. We all should know where we are in the history of the end of ancient Israel. And I want to remind us that you can place yourself there twice. You can do 2 applications with that line. So end of ancient Israel times 2, Because in that history, we have the baptism and also the cross lining up with the same waymark. 𝗬𝗲𝗃𝗃 gave a really good example of that in Portugal, explaining how we do that. Beginning of modern Israel. History of the Millerites. And I'll explain myself later, but you have at least 2 applications of that we should be all familiar with. So, beginning of modern Israel times 2. Place yourself on that history twice, 2 different places. Doesn't matter if you make a mistake. Discuss it together, do it. Discuss it with your brothers and sisters in the message who are around you. At least try to know where you are on these lines. Coming out of those applications, we can't forget the line of the priests and the line of the 144,000. Diadochi Wars. Place yourself in the history of the Diadochi Wars. 2 world wars, World War I, World War II. Know exactly where you are on the lines of the world wars. This one's interesting. I'm not sure what people would do with this, but we've been studying since it was done in October 2018, and I've mentioned it a few times since. The compare and the contrast between the internal and the external. Compare and contrast internal and external. Remembering it's an election year. Revolutions. I'm going to lump them all into one. Know where you are on the line of the revolutions. The counterfeit. It's a little like the internal, external. Know where you are in that history. So this is about 14, 15 different lines where you can go to them and you can map yourself. The problem is that when you're missing one of these lines, you're missing part of your experience. There's something about your experience right now that you don't understand, that you won't understand if you're missing your location on any one of these lines. And I know that they are not the only lines in existence. There are others, important ones. 𝗬𝗲𝗃𝗃 presenting in Portugal the history of Turkey and Egypt, and he shows where we are in that history, where we stand in 2020. So we should take that line. So there are others. But with these, we should all be able to know, or at least have on record so that we can check for any one of them to locate yourself on that line. So much that people are struggling with today would be answerable if they knew where they stood on every one of these lines. It is an anchor for our faith. So that's a little bit of a detour, because I wanted people to start thinking about that and looking at that prior to the Canadian camp meeting. So coming back to Acts 27, if we were just to remind ourselves about what Acts 27 teaches, it teaches us the experience of the United States and not just the United States, but Adventism in 2 different histories. Sorry, in two different ways. It's going to show you what I will oversimplify and call the negative perspective of these institutions from 1989. And it'll take you all the way to the Sunday law. It's going to show the United States and Adventism, the United States through Felix and Festus, showing our theme of the United States through Agrippa, Adventism. So you have two different institutions being given a warning message. This first ship of Adramyttium is showing the negative perspective. It means to abide in death. And it's going to take us through this history of 1989 through to the Sunday Law. This other ship, it also shows us that it's this other ship, that what I will oversimplify and call the positive ship, that actually shows us the problems that that ship faces, how it goes off course, how it doesn't follow directions, how it's hit by the east wind and finally shipwrecked. So there's negative aspects to this story, but overall it's portraying this ship as a good ship. It's designed to take Paul to his destination in Rome, where he is to spread the gospel. So it has its problems, but it's a positive perspective, and it takes you from 1798. And this positive perspective of the ship will show it begin in 1798. It will go off course in 1863. But it'll struggle through its history, fulfilling its job function. And it gives us quite neatly the dispensation of the 144,000. The early reign of the 144,000 that begins in 2001, has an increase of knowledge in 2019, it's formalized in 2021. So this second ship particularly gives us a neat perspective of that early reign dispensation for the 144,000. Both of these ships take you to the same point in time. Both of them take you to the Sunday Law, where these two institutions are going to be shipwrecked. These two institutions will fall. United States and Adventism, both falling or shipwrecked at the Sunday Law. So why am I mentioning that now? Through our studies over the last month, we've been particularly addressing one subject. So two questions. One subject, all taught through Acts 27, but two specific questions. We took us in our studies to well before 1798. We went right back. I'll begin it on this line. We went right back to 1619. And this was a turning point year for the United States. In 1619, does the lamb-like beast rise up? No, it's 179 years before 1798. So it's almost 180 years before the lamb-like beast is described as rising up out of the earth. It's a year before the Mayflower even lands in the colonies. So in this year, there's just these small British colonies, and for the very first time, they institute a system of government, a representative government in the colonies. So you have the beginning of representative government, and at the same time as this representative government forms, you have through this representative government, within a period of weeks, the enaction of Sunday law and the arrival of slavery. So you have this problem in the United States from very early on. It's not lamb-like in 1619. There's nothing lamb-like about these colonies. There was no religious freedom. There was no freedom. So we can see the United States, it had issues back in 1619. These two subjects that are dealt with first in 1850 and then in 1888 are already in existence. When we come to the United States in Bible prophecy, it's not represented as a lamb-like beast until 1798. They have to go through the revolution, enact the Constitution, form a representative government, form the Bill of Rights, etc. So it's demonstrated in Acts 27 as rising up here, and it's going to go through this history. And what this leaves us with is two particular questions we've been trying to address in our studies. The first question is, what is the sin of the United States? Now write these questions on the board. First question. What is the sin at the Sunday law? I put Sunday law in parentheses. What is the sin of the United States at the Sunday law? What makes it shipwreck at this waymark? Our second question. The United States falls here, the Republican horn is broken. We're looking at what that looks like. But our second question is what we have focused on for most of the last month. And that is, why does Adventism fall here? Why does Adventism fall at the Sunday law? So one question that we've been addressing relates to the institution of the United States. Another question we've been addressing relates to the institution of Adventism. And what we're trying to understand is why those two institutions fall at the Sunday law. The United States is going to enact a particular sin. We want to understand what that sin is. Adventism is going to fail when the United States enacts that sin. Why do they fail? We have spent most of our time on the second question, why does Adventism fall at the Sunday law? And we understood why it's going to fall at the Sunday law when we compared and contrast, went back to ancient Israel and recognized the Apis bull, the sin of idolatry, and the fact that we are following this in the footsteps of apostate Protestantism and have been for some time. Our worldview is on this side of the equation, and this is the side that's going to lead us to the Sunday law and to Adventism's acceptance of it. So we looked at, to understand the first question, I'm putting the second question to one side. So far we've done with that question. Why does Adventism fall at the Sunday law? The idolatry, the Apis bull, the conspiracy theories, Walter Weiss, all that we've done, Mary Relf to Walter Weiss, the conservative worldview. We've dealt with this question as much as we're going to for now. What I want to look at is, what is the sin of the United States? So this is the direction that we're heading in. To understand that, what we began to do is go back through this history and take our triple application. Our triple application being 1850, plus 1888 equals the Sunday law. So America's sin in 1850 plus America's sin in 1888 equals the sin of the Sunday law. You could say this another way. You could say that the account of early writings plus the account of the great controversy equals the sin. I had another way to put it. It just passed my mind. Oh yes, looking at the Ten Commandments. 1850 is crime against who? It's breaking the 6 about our fellow man. 1888 is breaking the what? The 4. Crime against God. 6 and the 4 equal the 10. So you can look at this in different ways. It's 1850 plus 1888 equals the Sunday law, the account of early writings, the account of the great controversy, equaling the sin of the Sunday law, and you also have the 6 commandments broken, then the 4 commandments broken, combined to see the 10 commandments broken in their entirety in this dispensation, the end of modern Israel. So as we look at these chapters, it's early writings and great controversy. It's the sins of Babylon and the scriptures a safeguard. Those 2 chapters with some surrounding context show us what the Sunday law looks like today. But we have to remember we're going from literal to spiritual. So this is early writing, slavery, literal, application, spiritual. Great controversy, Sunday laws, literal, application, spiritual. So this is literal plus the literal, these 2 literal histories to give us the spiritual or the symbolic. So we need to understand all of this to understand the Sunday law in our own time. What I want to do today is, before we consider starting to cut the history of 1619, particularly 1798, to the Sunday law, before we start cutting it up into these 1850, 1888 dispensations, I want us to look at the whole history as one connected story. One of the reasons that conspiracy theories exist is because people cannot recognize that we are dealing with the same issues that have plagued America for over 400 years. The issues being faced today are connected to the issues that have been in existence from the very beginning of the United States as a colony. So for now, forget about cutting the line. We're going to look at this whole history as a progression. Nothing comes out of the blue unexpectedly. Do we know what that phrase means, come out of the blue? If you're looking at the sky, nothing is just going to suddenly flash out of the blue, out of the sky, that you don't see coming. So when I say it's not going to come out of the blue, it's not going to come out of the blue sky without you seeing it on the horizon and seeing its progression, seeing it come to you. We can look back all the way to 1619 and see that Sunday law as it comes to us. It's not going to come as some type of surprise, not if you're prepared. So we're going to take this line. I'm going to rub out this, if you don't mind, I'll rub out here what we've done with Acts 27. I just wanted to do this so we could have a memory, truly understand what 2 questions we were trying to answer over the last month. Both questions you can take from Acts 27. We're dealing with the 2 institutions and why they fall. United States. What is the sin of the United States at the Sunday law? We're heading in that direction. We've spent most of our time focusing, why does Adventism fall here? So I want us to look at the history of the United States all the way back from 1619. It had the first representative government in the colonies, and this first representative government enacted a Sunday law at its very conception, and at the same time, weeks apart, so began the slavery within British colonies in the Americas. We'll skip about 170 years. In this history, you have the American Revolution. They fight for their freedom from Britain. They form the Republican government. They enact a constitution. They write the Bill of Rights. All of that history leading up to 1798. And what they do in this history is they make two particularly relevant claims to us. First of all, they separate church and state. Second, says all men are created equal. So at the very beginning they have the issue of Sunday law. As they form this new nation, they separate church and state. They put this wall between church and state. The second issue of slavery, they say all men are created equal. We remember 1798 rises up like a lamb like beast. You have this issue over the election. John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. But what this really represented was a split within Protestantism. There is this split within Protestantism through the two great awakenings. You have socially conservative Protestantism following John Adams, and you have this more socially liberal, inspired by the American Revolution, more liberal branch of Protestantism, following Thomas Jefferson. In 1798, this conservative branch introduces conspiracy theories, the Illuminati threat to try and take down the enemies of John Adams on both sides of the political spectrum, Hamilton, Jefferson. So you have the introduction of those conspiracy theories. I want us to look at this issue as it progresses on the subject of slavery. So both sides of that argument of abolition and for slavery are both led by Protestants. We need to remember particularly what Elder Parminder taught in Portugal when he discussed this time period, and he discussed the writings of 𝗏ci, and when 𝗏ci talks about the clergy and the public. Who are the public? The public are Protestants, because everyone in the United States there comes somehow under this concept of being a Protestant. There's a few Catholics, they're not liked, they're persecuted, but essentially everyone is Protestant, if I can be a little bit broad with that. So when you have this huge fight over slavery, both sides of that argument, north, south, for slavery, for abolition of slavery, are both led by different factions of Protestantism. And it's particularly interesting. What I'm not trying to do is cut our line. Because I'm not trying to cut our line, I'm not going to try and focus on key waymarks of that history. I'm going to not care about what dates I'm putting with that. I'm just going to put the relevant ones for our subject. But I do want to mention this, and I used this book in Portugal. It's a book titled America 1844, Religious Fervor, Westward Expansion, and the Presidential Election that Transformed the Nation. I'm going to read from page 41, just a small section. The year 1831 had been a propitious one for the embryonic abolitionist movement. So 1831 was a key year in this abolitionist movement. And why is 1831 become important to us? 1831 to 1833 is it's the formalization of our message, 31 to 33. William Lloyd Garrison founded the newspaper The Liberator in 1831. Abolitionists in Boston founded the New England Antislavery Society, and slaves led by Nat Turner rose up against their masters in Virginia. Southerners were annoyed by Garrison and the fledgling society. They were scared to death of Nat Turner. So they were annoyed by the Anti-Slavery Society. They were scared by the slave rebellion led by Nat Turner. 2 years later, in 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded. Its leaders soon launched a campaign to petition Congress to end slavery. So 1831 to 1833 are two key waymarks in that beginning of this key abolitionist movement. And if we go back a little more to 1824, in 1824 an English Quaker, Elizabeth Coltman Hayrick, published a bold tract titled Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition. She was the first of many devout women to defy the more conservative male leadership in the anti-slavery cause in both countries. Her influence was instrumental in the eventual passage of the Emancipation Act of 1833, which began the liberation of West Indian slaves, although she had died 2 years earlier. So she's an English Quaker. She's on both sides of the Atlantic, she's had this influence. In 1833, you have the Emancipation Act, beginning the liberation of West Indian slaves. So whether you're on either side of the Atlantic, these waymarks still become quite crucial. No less important were the female anti-slavery societies, where such noted speakers as the Quaker Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the eloquent black Sojourner Truth, and others began their speaking careers. Most famous of all were Angelina and Sarah Grimke, Quaker converts from South Carolina, who spoke to the horror of the conservative clergy at promiscuous mixed male and female audiences. So it was promiscuous then to have a mixed male and female audience in an auditorium. Women were supposed to only address and teach other women. But these, to the horror of the conservative evangelicals, these women would address mixed audiences. All of this and other efforts by other individuals led to the American Anti-Slavery Society of 1833, an abolitionist society formed by William Lloyd Garrison and Arthur Tappan. Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave, was a key leader of this society, who often spoke at its meetings. By 1838, the society had 1,350 local chapters with around 250,000 members. When you think of 250,000, that's quite a lot of members to this society when you consider the population in 1838. So, I'm not trying to mark waymarks in this history, but I do want to mark 1833 and the Anti-Slavery Society. So now you have two sides starting to form in the United States, two sides of Protestantism, because everyone is Protestant. We talked about Charles Finney. He's a leading Protestant evangelical teacher. He was an abolitionist who led at Oberlin College. This was the first American college to accept women and blacks as students in addition to white men. From its early years, its faculty and students were active in the abolitionist movement. They participated together with people of the town in biracial efforts to help fugitive slaves on the Underground Railroad, as well as to resist the Fugitive Slave Act, the Sunday law of that time period. These people were on the right side of the Sunday law. So they are Protestants. Charles Finney he's a Protestant. So you have these two split sides developing through Protestantism. Conservative Protestants, socially conservative and socially liberal. This all leads up to 1844. In 1844, it all unravels for them. That growing tension over decades blew up into a schism in the three main Protestant denominations of the United States. It split the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, and the Presbyterian Church. Those three denominations all divided in two, essentially along the lines of north and south. And this was the church split, the schism that was not reconcilable, that led them directly to the Civil War. And they split. Socially conservative were in favour of slavery, socially liberal in favour of abolition. We have to be careful against articles that actually claim to support our beliefs, who manipulate this history, just so we're on our guard. Even an article that is fighting against slavery in this history, that's saying our pioneers, our Millerite pioneers were against slavery, were leading abolitionists, even ones that support our beliefs can manipulate Millerite history to support them, and it becomes dangerous. Whether we like the article, whether we like the conspiracy theory, it doesn't matter what it is. If it manipulates history or uses wrong methodology, we should discard it. An article was shared with me this week that said how Millerites were leading abolitionists in this time period when very few people were fighting against slavery. That's so easily disproven. You don't have 250,000 members of one anti-slavery society at a time period when the population is so much smaller than today, without many people fighting against slavery, many abolitionists who were not Millerites. That isn't to discount our history of our leading pioneers as being people who stood for equal rights, who stood for the abolition of slavery and recognised it for what it was. They did do that. We should recognise that legacy and what they stood for, and the sin of the United States that they were able to recognise. But any article that even supports our beliefs but manipulates history should be discarded. And we're in growing danger of that. Coming back to this split in Protestantism. In the 19th century, slavery became the most critical moral issue dividing the Baptists in the United States. It really happened through decades of compromise. At the beginning, early in their history, prior to 1798, and through that into the early Second Great Awakening, Baptists opposed slavery. They never taught that slavery was biblical or not a sin. But as Baptist missionaries went into the South, they struggled to gain a foothold in the South. So they began to, by small incremental steps, they began to compromise in their message. So the next generation of Baptist preachers began to accommodate themselves into Southern society. Rather than challenging slavery the way that they had done at the beginning, they began to interpret certain Bible passages as if they were supporting the practice of slavery. They began to, first of all, defend it to the north. And this really developed in something we're going to discuss, into something that was what I today am going to call nationalistic. So the Baptists in the South are resenting the Baptists in the north, saying, you need to tell all those sinners down there to stop owning slaves. Those Southern Baptists who don't themselves own slaves, those ministers, they start resenting this intrusion of the North on their territory. So they start to push back against the North and saying, stay out of the South. And while you're at it, explain these verses and these passages. Maybe it isn't so bad after all. Deal with your own problems. Stop criticizing us. So they began to be this defensiveness, I'm going to call it a type of nationalism between the North and the South. They started preaching to slaves to accept their place and obey their masters. In the 2 decades after the Revolution, into the Second Great Awakening, the Southern Baptist preachers abandoned their pleas that the slaves be freed. So this didn't happen at once. It was incremental steps of those Southern ministers, partly because of their nationalism and their resentment of Southern encroachment on their territory, began to, first of all, justify slavery, excuse slavery, then more and more defend slavery, and then by the end say it was a God-given mandate. In 1844, Basil Manley Sr., president of the University of Alabama, this is the South, a prominent preacher and a major planter who owned 40 slaves, drafted the Alabama Resolutions and presented them to the Triennial Convention. These included the demand that slaveholders be eligible for denominational offices to which the Southern associations contributed financially. So what he's saying is, we Southerners support you financially, these associations, therefore you must be willing to admit Southern slave owners into denominational offices in the Baptist Church. These resolutions failed to be adopted. So you can see this divide between North and South just with the churches before it becomes the state, and it's nationalistic in its mentality. The South is saying, we give our money to you, we support you, and yet you're not giving us leadership positions and authority. In Georgia, the Baptists decide they're going to test the North. They're going to put a test before the North. The North claims neutrality. The North has its issues with compromising. They say they're in this kind of neutral position. So Georgia decides to test them. And when a position opens up in the Home Missionary Society, they need a missionary, Georgia recommends a slaveholder. The Home Mission Society's board refuses to appoint him, noting that missionaries were not allowed to take servants with them. So the missionaries weren't allowed to take a servant, and if you're not allowed to take a servant, clearly you can't take a slave. So they would not make a decision that had any appearance of endorsing slavery, although they do it in this roundabout kind of fashion. Southern Baptists considered this an infringement of their right to determine their own candidates. So this is a north-south tension between northern states and southern states in the Baptist church. It's nationalistic in its mentality. The South is saying, we give you money, we support you financially. Over the decades before, they've more and more come to a position where they see slavery as being mandated by God because of their literal to literal interpretation. Ancient Israel had slaves, modern Israel has slaves. So they're going to use two arguments to defend slavery. One of them is that to not support slavery and not allow us to support slavery in our own states is a violation of our freedom. And they're also going to argue it's a violation of our religious liberty. Remember, we're talking about the South here. Their argument in defense of slavery, their argument against the North, you are violating our freedoms and you are violating our religious liberty to practice our understanding of Bible history and what God requires of us as a nation. religious freedom, and liberty. So this causes the split in the Baptist church, and it's quite similar in the Methodist and Presbyterian churches. There's a few other issues at play there too, but it all centers around the subject of slavery. We haven't concretely presented the Millerite history in all of its lines, in all of its main line and all of its fractals. But if you can, I just make a statement that, and I can prove it to you at another point in time. I'm going to say 1848 is a waymark in Millerite history. I think that might have already been taught somewhere. But 1848 is a waymark. I want to mark 1848. So we're tracking this split within Protestantism, but it also, all of these are Protestants. The government is filled with these Protestant men. You can't really separate these two issues. The title of the book that I was reading from, Sister Susan, is America, 1844. I'm not sure if you can read that. Religious fervor, westward expansion, and the presidential election that transformed the nation. It's an interesting book. It goes through the forming of the Mormon Church, westward expansion, the annexation of Texas, the election, all of that history. So it's a good time to ask that question, because coming back to that 1844 election, what was that election over? That election was over annexing Texas from Mexico. Do we all kind of remember that history? 1844, there's a US election, there's this divide between these two political parties, and that divide is whether or not they will admit or they will annex Texas from Mexico and admit it into the Union as a state. And we discussed that in Portugal. So 1844 that election went on the wrong side of history. It went on the wrong side of history that led to the Mexican War just after 1844, and they annexed Texas. That whole history is absolutely crucial to that reform line, how America expanded. So that's the subject of 1848 that we're about to discuss. When do we finish Sabbath school? Okay. 1848. I'm not sure if we're familiar with the man 𝗃𝗃 Calhoun. I'll just write his name for a moment and then erase it. 𝗃𝗃 Calhoun, he's quite legendary in that history. He's a senator from North Carolina, and he becomes a future spokesman, in the future, a spokesman for Southern secession. He was supportive, of course, of this American expansion into Texas. So what you have is this. In Portugal, I had Sister Kathy draw a wonderful map of the United States. So I can't do that. So I'm just going to have a blob. That's the United States. Somewhere over here, you have Mexico. I'm not trying to be realistic. Please don't. I'm just doing blobs. You have the United States and you have Mexico. And they want to take Texas from Mexico. They decide in the 1844 election that's the path they're going to go down, American expansion. There was a phrase that began around that time. I can't remember. What was that phrase? If someone can think of it, put it in the chat. The manifest destiny. It was manifest destiny for the United States. Thank you, brother. Thank you. It was the manifest destiny of the United States to spread and take control over that whole, from sea to shining sea. I want us to think about the branch that we're talking about here. We're talking about this particularly southern, particularly social conservative, supporting slavery that's also supporting the expansion of the United States. John C. Calhoun, a senator from South Carolina, is a major part of that. I'm quoting him. I will quote him. He spoke in Congress January 4 of 1848. At the time, US and Mexican diplomats were in the midst of negotiating a peace treaty. So 1844, the United States decides to annex Texas. Then the following year, they go to war with Mexico. Might be 1846, I might be off there. But they go to war with Mexico in 1848. Both parties come to the table and they just start to negotiate a peace treaty to determine how much of Mexico will be admitted into the Union. Quoting Calhoun, how much of Mexico did the United States want? We have never dreamt of incorporating into our union any but the Caucasian race, the free white race. To incorporate Mexico would be the very first instance of the kind of incorporating an Indian race. For more than half of the Mexicans are Indians, and the other is composed chiefly of mixed tribes. I protest against such a union as that. Ours, sir, is the government of a white race. The great misfortunes of Spanish America are to be traced to the fatal error of placing these black races on equality with the white race. Are we to associate with ourselves as equals, companions, and fellow citizens, the Indians and mixed race of Mexico? Mr. President, I would consider such a thing fatal to our institutions. We make a great mistake, sir, when we suppose that all people are capable of self-government. We are anxious to force free government on all. And I see that it has been urged in a very respectable quarter, that it is the mission of this country to spread civil and religious liberty over all the world, and especially over this continent. It is a great mistake. None but people advanced to a very high state of moral and intellectual improvement are capable in a civilized state of maintaining free government. So I read that to my sister earlier this morning and she responded in non-verbal communication, which I won't repeat on camera. But this is, do we recognize what he's saying? I want us to think about the implications of that. The United States decides to take from Mexico. They could have taken more. They don't want more. Why do they not want Mexico? Because they're not white enough. It's racism at its beginning. What we're looking at, it's quite curious to me. It's like a reversal of literal to spiritual. What do we have today? We have a literal war on the US-Mexican border to keep out who? People who essentially are not white enough. It's not just white and black. It's mixed race. It's the Southern American people as well. But this wall that Donald Trump is building, he's making the same argument as they made in 1848 when they could have had Mexico and they chose to not have Mexico. They didn't want it. They didn't want it because it was composed of Indians and mixed race people largely. And to admit more of Mexico into the Union would have meant to include those people as citizens of the United States and therefore dilute the white race. So they're going to argue against admitting more of Mexico into the Union, which I just find so interesting today when we have the same argument between the United States and Mexico and who the United States will allow through that border. It's the original border war, except it's like we have the literal today and they had the spiritual then. But what argument is he using to defend this racism? He says we are anxious to force free government on all. It is the role of this country to spread civil and religious liberty. The argument they are using on behalf of this belief is freedom and religious liberty, the role of the United States, the need to protect that role. So this is 2 years before the North and South come to their disagreement in 1850 and then resolve it with the Fugitive Slave Act. So in 1850 we have the Fugitive Slave Act. And this really explains, we won't go into detail of this article, of this law, but this starts to explain why Ellen White says God's judgment was upon the North. The South is already so far gone, but the judgment is upon the North because of how they consistently compromised. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, by the way, remember, I think it was 1792 or 1793. It had already been in existence. It's just repeated and reinforced in 1850. It's nothing new. It was enacted, it was written and enacted by the North. Written by the fellow, the good guy who lost the 1844 election to the bad guy. So I'm going to skip that 1850 because I'm not trying to do the reform line. I'm going to come to the Civil War, 1861 to 1863. (1861 to 1863). Sorry, 1861 to 1865. The history of the Civil War. So now we have our official civil war. The states are divided. The churches within those states had already split. Now the states themselves are going to divide. I want to discuss a concept here that can become it can become quite a toxic subject. I hope that I'm understood in what I want to say about this subject. What I'm going to discuss is state rights. I know people don't like to discuss the role of state rights in the Civil War. And there's a couple of reasons why people don't like to do that. First of all, I recognise that the issue of state rights is broader than, it's not a simple issue. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850. How did the northern states manage to bypass that Fugitive Slave Act? They used the principles of state rights. So even though the government wanted to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, the northern states, for the most part, actually didn't act on it because they were able to bypass it with their own state laws and legislatures. And this bypassing of the northern states, where they don't enforce this Fugitive Slave Act, is what each one of those southern states cite as their key, one of their main key grievances at the beginning of the Civil War. It really upset the South that these northern states didn't comply. But we're talking about this time period of the Civil War, the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. Putting aside all his problems, you now have the right guy who's president. You have the good guy in. He's elected president on November 6 of 1860. Southern Carolina exploded with excitement at the news. We discussed Calhoun. He was representative of Southern Carolina. To many of the people there, Lincoln's victory was the signal that ended the state's ties to the Union. To them, it was the beginning of Southern independence. The day that Abraham Lincoln won that election, South Carolina lowered their United States flags and raised their state flag in its place. They were joyful. It was the beginning of Southern independence. It was the Southern states' attempt to secede based on the 10th Amendment argument that Lincoln's actions were designed to prevent, and this led to the Civil War. So, what I want to do to explain and defend this position of state rights is take you to the words of the states themselves. Every state in the Confederacy issued an article of secession declaring their break from the Union. 4 states went further than that: Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina. South Carolina, Calhoun, that link. All issued additional documents, usually referred to as the Declarations of Causes, which explain their decision to leave the Union. I'm going to read a little. I'm going to quote some of the words from these 4 states that wrote the Declarations of Secession. I'm going to start with Georgia. The people of Georgia, having dissolved their political connection with the government of the United States of America, present to their Confederates and the world the causes which have led to the separation. For the last 10 years we have had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. Our northern Confederates, after a full and calm hearing of all the facts, after a fair warning of our purpose not to submit to the rule of the authors of all these wrongs and injuries, have by a large majority committed the government of the United States into their hands. So they're referencing back to the election of Abraham Lincoln. It's a grievance. The northern states have submitted the government into the hands of what these people see as abolitionists. The people of Georgia, after an equally full and fair and deliberate hearing of the case, have declared with equal firmness that this government shall not rule over them. A brief history of the rise, progress, and policy of anti-slavery and the political organization into whose hands the administration of the federal government has been committed will fully justify the pronounced verdict of the people of Georgia. The party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party under its present name and organization, is of recent origin. It is admitted to be an anti-slavery party. While it attracts to itself by its creeds the scattered advocates of exploded political heresies, of condemned theories in political economy, the advocates of commercial restrictions, of protections, of special privileges, of waste and corruption in the administration of government, anti-slavery is its mission and its purpose. By anti-slavery it is made a power of the state. The question of slavery was the great difficulty in the way of the formation of the Constitution. With these principles on their banners and these utterances on their lips, the majority of the people of the North demand that we shall receive them as our rulers. Remember what we said about Protestantism, about the nationalism that began to arise between the northern and the southern branches of the Baptist denomination. You're seeing the same thing now within the state governments. And what the South is saying is that the North, by this large majority, through that election, have elected a president who is opposed to slavery. It's an anti-slavery party in their mind, and he's going to violate the autonomy and the rights of the states. So it is a states' rights argument that they're making. South Carolina said this most clearly. The people of the state of South Carolina in convention assembled on the 26th day of April 1852, going back to 1852, declared that the frequent violations of the Constitution of the United States by the federal government and its encroachment upon the reserved rights of the states fully justified this state in then withdrawing from the federal union. So South Carolina wanted to withdraw from the union in 1852 because of this encroachment by that federal government upon a state's rights. But in deference to the opinions and wishes of the other slaveholding states, she forbore at that time to exercise this right. Since that time, these encroachments have continued to increase, and further forbearance ceases to be a virtue. So right back in 1952, they're protesting the encroachment of the federal government on states' rights. In the year 1765, they're going to go back. The portion of the British Empire embracing Great Britain undertook to make laws for the government of that portion composed of the 13 American colonies. So they're going to go back and say you had Britain, this central government, and you had 13 colonies. A struggle for the right of these colonies to govern themselves ensured self-government, which resulted in 1776 in a declaration by the colonies, quoting the colonies, that they are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to do. I'm just going to finish this portion about states' rights and then we will close our first meeting. They further solemnly declared that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of the ends for which it was established, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. Deeming the government of Great Britain to have become destructive of these ends, they declared that the colonies are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So South Carolina is saying we are repeating the American Revolution for independence, and the argument is the right of the colonies or the states to freely govern themselves. In pursuance of this Declaration of Independence, each of the 13 states proceeded to exercise its separate sovereignty, adopted for itself a constitution, and appointed officers for the administration of government in all of its departments, legislative, executive, and judicial. For purposes of defence, they united their arms and their councils, and in 1778 they entered into a league known as the Articles of Confederation, whereby they agreed to entrust the administration of their external relations to a common agent, known as the Congress of the United States, expressly declaring in the first article that each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. Under this confederation, the War of the Revolution was carried on, and on the 3rd of September 1783 the contest ended, and a treaty was signed by Great Britain, in which she acknowledged the independence of the colonies in the following terms. His Britannic Majesty, this is Article 1, acknowledges the said United States, and it names the colonies, to be free, sovereign, independent states, that he treats them with them as such, and for himself, his heirs and successors relinquishes all claims to the government, propriety and territorial rights. Thus were established by the two great principles asserted by the colonies, namely, the right of a state to govern itself and the right of a people to abolish a government when it becomes destructive of the ends for which it was instituted. And concurrent with the establishment of these principles was, in fact, that each colony became and was recognized by the mother country, writing in all capitals, a free, sovereign, independent state. In the present case, that fact is established with certainty. We assert that 14 of the states have deliberately refused for past years to fulfill their constitutional obligations, and we refer to their own statutes for the proof. It says for 25 years this agitation has been increasing until it has now secured to its aid the power of the common government. A sectional party has found within that article establishing the executive department, the presidency, Abraham Lincoln, the means of subverting the Constitution itself. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. The guarantees of the Constitution will then no longer exist. The equal rights of the states will be lost, states' rights. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection, and the federal government will have become their enemy. So we've quoted from Georgia and South Carolina. And what are they arguing for? They're arguing that it violates their freedom, and it violates their state rights. The reason people don't like to talk about state rights is because it's usually used by those who defend the South as an excuse. They say they were defending their rights as states. It wasn't about slavery. And they try and make the South look better in this whole argument. So then those opposed to or for equality, their reaction is it had nothing to do with state rights. It was about slavery. The truth is, it was about state rights because that was their excuse to defend slavery. The issue was slavery. If they didn't want slavery, they would never have had a problem with Abraham Lincoln and their state rights. So the issue is slavery. I'm not denying that. But their defense of that institution is going to be their independent rights as states. Short quote from Texas. It essentially says quite the same thing. This acquiring of sufficient power in the common government is a means of destroying the institutions of Texas and the sister slaveholding states. So this executive branch, this government that South Carolina described as Great Britain, has acquired enough power that it's going to destroy the independence, the institutions of Texas and the other slaveholding states. In all the non-slaveholding states, in violation of that good faith and comity which should exist between entirely distinct nations, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party. So they're saying the non-slaveholding states, where they should exist as entirely distinct nations, have united under Abraham Lincoln. So they're going to accuse the North of not defending their own state rights in forming this government. They're saying that these states should have how much freedom? The states should be as if they were entire distinct nations. The people have made themselves strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of the other states, the southern states, based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or colour. That debasing doctrine of equality, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law. The other argument they're going to argue for, religious liberty. We have defended in prior presentations the fact that the South used the claim of religious liberty, their right to practice what they believed God had mandated, slavery, as an excuse for the Civil War. They believed slavery was instituted from the beginning in ancient Israel through New Testament times, and as the United States was the glorious land, they would have institutionalized slavery, and to abolish it would be to violate their religious liberty. So what I want us to see in this history, as this issue of slavery grows and develops, these two branches of Protestantism splitting, first as denominations, then it heads and the states themselves split. It's over this nationalism that has developed. And what you have is the South defending all the way through this history, whether it's the Southern Baptists or whether it's South Carolina, that what is being impinged upon is their freedom and their religious liberty. And once you get to 1861, they're going to say that this core government is impinging on the rights of the states to govern themselves. So we'll close now. When we come back, I want us to we're going to keep tracking this history. We'll move beyond slavery and see how this divide in Protestantism continues to develop. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you for your goodness towards us, Lord, for your mercies. Lord, we see where you have led your people in the past. We are grateful when we look back and see that our pioneers saw these issues in a correct light, in a warped light, Lord. They did not understand full equality at the end of the world. They did not understand the return to Eden. But for their time, Lord, they accepted just what you required them to accept, and that is the abolition of slavery. I pray, Lord, that we will see these issues more deeply, that we will not be content with surface treasure, but that we will look deeper to see what is actually happening, what defenses are being made to defend sin, what arguments are being made to defend nationalism, what is dividing the glorious land. Lord, as we see that, I pray that we might make correct application for our own experience. Thank you for your Sabbath day, and I pray that you will be close to all of those all over the world who are worshipping now, Lord, who are entering into Sabbath, wherever they are, Lord, that they'll have a blessed Sabbath day. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.